Committee will come to order without objection. The chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 7185, the Federal Contracting for Peace and Security Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 7185, the Federal Contracting for Peace and Security Act.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 7185, offered by Mrs. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as a base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize myself to speak in support of H.R. 7185. On March 16th, several weeks after Russia launched its unprovoked and illegal war on the peaceful country of Ukraine, Russian forces flying over the battered city of Mariupol saw a word from their aircraft. It was the Russian word for children, painted in gigantic letters. Listen, just as you can see here, underscoring their brutality on either side of the city's theater, where hundreds of local families had sought shelter from the brutal shelling and bitter cold. Despite that word, or perhaps because of it, the Russians targeted their bombs at that theater, killing an estimated over 300 men, women, and children. Recently, as Ukrainian forces have liberated areas near Kyiv from the Russians, we've seen even more unspeakable horrors, including hundreds of civilians executed by Russian soldiers. These are war crimes perpetrated by Putin's Russia to break the will of the Ukrainian people. For these atrocities, we have no words, but we have actions. On the same day that Mariupol theater was bombed, Ukrainian President Zelensky addressed Congress and called on us to do more. He thanked us for the sanctions, but said it was not enough and that we should look for loopholes and ways to close the going of any American dollars to Russia. He said American companies should leave the Russian market immediately because it is, quote, flooded with the blood of the Ukrainian people, end quote. He also asked to, quote, make sure that the Russians do not receive a single U.S. penny that they can use to destroy the people in Ukraine. I found a loophole. It's the private contracting area procurement for the federal government. We spend over $640 billion a year, and we trace $28 billion of it going to Russia. I introduced a bill, H.R. 7185, the Federal Contracting for Peace and Security Act. My bill would supplement the sanctions and other efforts already underway against Russians by prohibiting the federal government from contracting with companies that continue to conduct business operations in Russia. This only applies to the contracting bill of federal dollars. The bill includes common sense exemptions for contracts that benefit or serve the Ukrainian people for humanitarian, that serve the Russian people for humanitarian purpose or the Ukrainian people to meet basic human needs. Federal agencies would also be allowed to waive the requirements with a written certification to the President and to Congress that doing so is in the national interest of the United States. The prohibition would remain in effect until the Secretary of State and Secretary of Treasury jointly determined that Russia has done enough to restore the safety and sovereignty of Ukraine. Americans do not want their tax dollars going to companies doing business in Russia. According to a recent poll, over 75% of Americans said companies should halt their business operations in Russia, and a majority said they would not support a company that refused to do so. Congress must honor the will of the American people, respond to President Zelensky's plea, and support its own national security and policy goals by passing this bill. We have worked closely with a wide range of companies, industries, and other stakeholders to fine-tune the legislation. The amendment in the nature of a substitute that I'm offering is a fair, reasonable balance to addressing administrative concerns raised by businesses while ensuring we're pressing. For example, the ANS clarifies the bill applies to prime contracts and major subcontracts, and that waivers can be granted by agencies for both national security and public interest. The ANS would ensure that companies are not penalized for actions taken in Russia to support the suspension of business operations, including actions to secure a company's facilities, property, or equipment. In the interest of time, I am going to place the rest of my comments in the record because my time has expired, and the ranking member is reminding me of that. Trust me saying it, it's a great bill. It should be a bipartisan bill. I hope everyone will vote for this bill, and I yield back. Who else seeks recognition?
I do.
Okay.
Thank you. Am I?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair. On February 24th, Russian forces invaded the sovereign nation of Ukraine. In the weeks since, the world has witnessed Putin's brutality. The images coming out of the Kyiv suburbs over the past few days are clear evidence Putin's military specifically targeted and executed civilians. He is a war criminal and should be treated as such. But Putin clearly underestimated the will of the Ukrainian people in their fight for their freedom. Therefore, it's vital that the United States take affirmative steps to continue to support the Ukrainians and end Russian aggression. In response to Putin's attack on Ukraine, the U.S. and our allies instituted unprecedented sanctions on Russia. I agree that more can be done to respond to Russia's aggression. That is, Republican members on our committee requested a hearing to make sure the money Congress obligated is actually reaching Ukraine. That said, we have to be sure actions we take do not have the unintended consequence of hurting U.S. interests and our national security capabilities more than it does our enemies. The bill in front of us would ban U.S. companies from working with the federal government if the company is doing business of any kind in Russia. While this sounds simple, I'm concerned it could prove difficult to implement, bringing potentially severe consequences for both U.S. businesses and the federal government, including the readiness of our armed forces. Fully unwinding business operations in a foreign country, particularly Russia, is a complicated and time-consuming process. It would be nearly impossible for every contractor to certify that their supply chains are completely void of any component from Russia. Further, the bill only gives a month for rulemaking, a timeline that is unlikely to be reached and leaves few opportunities for input from industry experts. This will likely leave contractors and contracting officers exposed with little to no guidance how to proceed. Madam Chair, I appreciate the efforts you have made to address some of the many concerns stakeholders have raised in the past few weeks since the bill was introduced. However, we received your revisions less than 48 hours ago, and that is not enough time to get to a level of comfort this bill will work as intended. And most importantly, this bill and the latest changes have not yet been fully evaluated by the government agencies that will be in charge of implementing these expansive prohibition requirements. The committee also lacks feedback from the Defense Department, which more than ever needs to be able to take full advantage of the supplies, services, and technology American industry has to offer. With so many unknowns, I simply cannot support this legislation. But I do think we should have a hearing on the money Congress has already obligated to help us better understand what other steps we can be affirmatively taking to help Ukraine. I yield back.
This is a bill that was based on a bill that many states and cities passed over South Africa and the effort to end apartheid there, and it worked. The City of New York, I authored this bill when I was a city council member. The City of New York banned our billions of dollars from going to South Africa. And we're in a crisis now. Zelensky has asked us to stop American dollars going to Russia. This bill responds to it. And my colleague is claiming that this legislation is unworkable. But that's simply not true. You may want to vote against it, but it's not true that it's unworkable. The amendment in the nature of a substitute offered today allows for the Office of Management and Budget to use emergency procedures to put out implementation guidance quickly. These kinds of expedited procedures were used successfully during the pandemic, and the urgency of this situation calls for them as well. However, contractor input through public comment will be essential to getting this right, which is why the ANS directs OMB to incorporate such comments to the greatest extent practicable. Over the coming days, we will continue to work with both industry groups and OMB to ensure the legislation strikes the right balance. Additionally, it is common practice for the government to provide contractors with advance notice if their contract is in danger of termination. That's why the ANS requires written notice to contractors at least 15 days before the initiation of termination proceedings. This will grant additional time and warning for the contractor to take necessary action that might avoid termination. The bill also ensures flexibility to allow contractors the time they need to come into compliance. This is through the good faith extension added by the ANS, which allows agency to delay the initiation of termination proceedings in increments of 30 days for a contractor that has pursued and continues to pursue all reasonable steps forward, achieving compliance, and provides a written plan for how they will do so. I also want to point out that the ANS narrows the scope of the bill to only apply to prime contractors and major subcontractors. This approach will simplify implementation considerably. Taken together, these changes mean that if a company is making a genuine good faith effort to comply with the law, it will not be penalized. So I urge a yes vote on this bill. And who else seeks recognition? The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 7185 as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
Okay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is agreed to. H.R. 7185 shall be favorably reported to the House without objection. A motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the matters considered by the committee in this markup. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 6531, the Targeting Resources to Communities in Need Act of 2022. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 6531, the Targeting Resources to Communities in Need Act of 2022.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6531, offered by Mrs. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read, will serve as a base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize myself to speak in support of H.R. 6531, the Targeting Resources to Communities in Need Act. This bipartisan bill was introduced by Jim Clyburn and Hal Rogers, and I am a proud co-sponsor. This bill would provide additional transparency about areas of persistent poverty and target more federal resources to these areas. Areas of persistent poverty are defined as census tracts or counties with a poverty rate greater than 20% over the last 30 years. According to the Census Bureau, the official rate of poverty in the United States was 11.4% in 2020, which amounts to 37.2 million people. Poverty is experienced by Americans of all backgrounds in rural, urban, and suburban communities. This bill would require the Census Bureau to publish a list of all areas of persistent poverty and require the Office of Management and Budget to work with agencies to steer more federal investments to those areas. GAO would periodically evaluate the effectiveness of this program for the next 10 years. I urge all my colleagues to support this bipartisan legislation to bring attention and investment to communities that face persistent poverty. I yield back. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Comer, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney. H.R. 6531 directs the Office of Management and Budget to lead a government-wide effort to increase the share of federal funds going to high and persistent poverty counties in a consistent manner across all agencies. This legislation will provide a more up-to-date listing of areas of persistent poverty in our nation and help struggling rural Americans gain greater access to the many taxpayer-funded poverty assistance programs. While the federal government currently spends an enormous amount on low-income populations, it's important that funding be targeted especially to our most vulnerable communities. I appreciate the bill's intentions, and I also urge us here on the committee to recognize that we must maintain diligent oversight over how federal agencies administer taxpayer-funded assistance programs. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Who else seeks recognition? Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to support this bill. Our poorest citizens and our rural communities, our most financially challenged American citizens across the country deserve due consideration for the dissemination of American treasure through federal programs. They deserve the attention that they may not have the political clout to get because they live in areas of our nation that don't necessarily get the attention of politicians up here. So I'm going to support this bill, and I appreciate the spirit of it. I yield.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on favorably reporting out 6531 HR as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is agreed to. HR 6531 shall be favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the matters considered by the committee in this markup. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 1756, the Measuring Real Income Growth Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 1756, the Measuring Real Income Growth Act.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 1756, offered by Mrs. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for purposes of amendment. I recognize myself. Last year, I introduced H.R. 1756, the Measuring Real Income Growth Act, which would improve the economic reporting released by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, or BEA. The BEA releases GDP, gross domestic product, data quarterly and annually. While national GDP trends provide useful information on the state of the overall economy, they tell a very incomplete story. H.R. 1756 directs the BEA to calculate and report GDP or other appropriate economic indicators by income decile for the top 1% of income earners. This will allow us to see who is benefiting and who is not benefiting from GDP growth. The 2019 Appropriations Bill directed the BEA to develop a prototype report that breaks down personal income data by income level, and the BEA released these prototype reports in 2020 and 21. This is an excellent start. By codifying the reporting requirement, we can maintain momentum behind this effort to provide both the public and private sector with this important information permanently. Economic ups and downs do not affect all families equally. I have introduced this bill in previous Congresses because it would greatly improve our ability to address income inequality, which has increased steadily over the past decades. And this bill is even more important as we enter a post-pandemic recovery. Having more granular information about how families at every income level are faring in the economic recovery will help ensure that no one is left behind. I am pleased that the Biden administration all supports this policy. The President's budget for the Commerce Department calls for additional funding at BEA to do this type of analysis. The Department's budget justification to Congress says, and I quote, "Expansion of distributional measures will equip policymakers with the information they need to further support the economic recovery and drive future investment and development of a broad range of economic and social policies," end quote. H.R. 1756 would support this effort. Simply put, better data leads to better, fair outcomes. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this straightforward legislation, and I yield back. Who else seeks recognition? The ranking member, Mr. Comer, is so recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Gross domestic product is an important statistic used to track our nation's economic health. However, measuring the Real Income Growth Act tries to create a new, quote, GDP 2.0 that would do little more than blame one group's economic pressures on those who achieve success in our society. Make no mistake, the true aim of this bill is to create division and resentment and help Democrats move ever closer to their wish for a socialist America. We only need to look at President Biden's newly proposed wealth tax to see where this is all going. Let's redistribute wealth as we Democrats see fit. Instead of trying to divide the nation further, I wish the majority would focus on our crippling debt and soaring inflation, which has been fueled by the Democrats' reckless and endless spending during the past year. I urge all my colleagues to oppose this bill, and I yield back.
Madam Chairwoman.
Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chairwoman.
Mr. oh, welcome back.
Thank you. I just wanted to say I certainly was taken in with the ranking member's call for not having further division, bringing us together, and then hearing the jarring comments about reckless Democrats and whatever it is we're up to. Either we
Spending too much money.
Yeah, maybe we could take a look at those deficits into the Trump years. I don't know. But if we're going to come together, let's come together. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you. Who else seeks recognition? Does anyone seek recognition? The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 1756 as amended. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is
Madam
agreed
Chair,
to.
I request a recorded vote on this.
A recorded vote has been requested. A
Madam
recorded
Chair.
vote is ordered. The clerk will call the, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 11 and Committee Rule 5B, proceedings on the bill are postponed. Okay. Pursuant to notice, I now call up 6967, the Chance to Compete Act.
Hold on, just one moment. Okay. Sorry, we're going to flip them. Just a moment.
Going to go to a different one. Okay, pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 7376, the Honoring Civil Servants Killed in Line of Duty Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
She's going to. She just had to flip things around.
Okay.
H.R. 7376, the Honoring Civil Servants Killed in the Line of Duty Act.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 7376, the Honoring Civil Servants Killed in the Line of Duty Act, introduced by Mrs. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as a base text for purpose of the amendment. I now recognize the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Conley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you for bringing up this bill. Unfortunately, 24 federal civilian employees die every year while in the nation's service. In recent years, because of the pandemic, that number has been even higher. Unlike counterparts in the U.S. military and the Foreign Service, families of employees in the civil service who die in the line of duty are not provided adequate benefits when their loved ones make the ultimate sacrifice. The Honoring Civil Servants Killed in the Line of Duty Act takes long overdue steps to bring civil service in line with other federal service sectors by updating the benefits provided to the survivors of those who die in the line of duty. These deaths might include, for example, seasonal firefighters killed while tackling a raging blaze out west, a national park ranger killed in a mudslide, a postal worker killed in a vehicle accident, a Federal Bureau of Investigation agent shot while tailing a suspect, a FEMA employee cleaning up tornado messes in Kentucky. The bill raises the one-time benefit of the survivors of a civil servant killed in the line of duty from the current $10,000, which was set in 1997, 25 years ago, to $100,000, which is in line with the amount paid to survivors of military and foreign service employees killed in the line of duty. The bill also increases the amount provided for funeral expenses from $800, which was last adjusted in the presidency of Lyndon Johnson, Madam Chairwoman, to $8,000 to help defray funeral costs. Currently, survivors of those killed while in the Foreign Service or serving in the military receive a one-time lump sum of approximately $200,000. This bill on the civil side would be $100,000. In addition, H.R. 7376 would provide automatic cost of living adjustments to the death and funeral benefits so we're not waiting 60 years. It would expand the scope of who qualifies as a beneficiary. It would clarify who qualifies as a federal civil servant for the purposes of the benefit. It would ensure that agencies treat the benefit as mandatory and not discretionary. It would codify that benefit as not taxable. It would make administrative conforming changes to the Foreign Service and military death benefits and would authorize funding in certain cases where a major event may cause a large number of federal civilian deaths. Funds to pay the benefit will come from existing department discretionary funds. Our anticipation is this will not cost additional funds. The executive branch, however, could request additional funding if there were a mass casualty event, God forbid. This bill has a bipartisan companion Senate bill championed by Senator Sinema of Arizona. That bill is reported out of the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee favorably. The House bill is similar but incorporates some feedback from the OMB and the Office of Personnel Management that makes the bill more practical to administer. It reaches the same policy goals and ensures equity, death benefit, gratuities across federal service. Today's ANS also incorporates a provision to ensure that recipients of the death gratuity are not required to pay taxes on them. I want to thank the minority staff for highlighting for us that provision and was glad to add it. I also want to thank my co-sponsors, Ms. Norton, Mr. Raskin, Mr. Lynch. And lastly, I want to point out that this bill is endorsed by a number of organizations, including the National Active and Retired Federal Employees Association, the Air Marshal Association, the National Treasury Employees Union, the National Federation of Federal Employees, the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, the Senior Executive Association, the Professional Managers Association, National Association of Assistant United States Attorneys, National Postal Mail Handlers, the Federal Managers Association, the American Foreign Service Association, and the International Federation of Professional and Technical Engineers.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
To a question? Mr. Conley, I'm sorry, Madam Chair. You good, Madam Chair? Mr. Donalds from Florida. I'm way down front, Mr. Conley. Hey, how you
Oh,
doing?
yeah. Well, I'm trying to finish my opening statement.
No, I know. I want to let you finish it, but quick question. So
Okay.
I was asking if you yield to it.
Just 1 second, if the chair will allow. I thank the chair. At any rate, I look forward to getting this across the finish line. I know the families of civil servants who die in the line of duty are looking forward to this long overdue update on their benefits. And with the chairman's permission, I, of course, will yield for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Conley.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Mr. Donalds for as much time as you need. Okay.
Well, Madam Chair, it's more of a question for the sponsor of the legislation. You mentioned in your statement that there doesn't appear to be a cost associated with extending and increasing these benefits. If we're going to be increasing the size of death benefits and other situations dealing with the death of a federal employee in the line of duty, how can we then also make the assertion that there is no increase in cost to the federal government?
Fair question. As I indicated, we're talking about 24 people a year. This is not hundreds and hundreds of people, thank God. 24. And in talking to the executive branch, the respective agencies involved can absorb that cost.
Okay.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Comer, do you now seek recognition? Who else seeks recognition? Yep, Mr. Comer is now recognized ranking member.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I applaud the dedication and service of our many federal employees. However, federal civilian employees and postal workers already receive access to world-class pay and benefits during their federal service, and their dependents are eligible for substantial benefits upon their deaths. In addition to discretionary authority to award a $10,000 death gratuity for federal workers who die in the line of duty, dependents of federal employees are also entitled to compensation under the Federal Employees Compensation Program. This program operates as a workers' compensation program for federal employees, with dependent spouses generally receiving 2/3 of the deceased employee's salary for the duration of the spouse's life or until they remarry. Dependent children are also covered and receive compensation until they reach the age of 18. Those payments are not taxable. Additionally, federal employees will have full access to life insurance benefits through the Federal Employees Group Life Insurance Program, with their federal government employer subsidizing 1/3 of the cost. In addition to life insurance and workers' comp, surviving spouses or dependent children may be eligible for death benefits under the Federal Employee Retirement System. All of these death benefits are in addition to a generous pay scale, job stability, health insurance, flexible spending accounts, the thrift savings plan, and employee assistance programs. All benefits provided and subsidized by the taxpayers. Meanwhile, few private sector employees receive this growing list of benefits. Most private sector employees definitely do not receive death gratuities on top of workers' compensation plans or their own life insurance policies. While I'm sympathetic to wanting to provide additional death benefits, the U.S. federal government already provides more benefits than almost any employer in the country. And with this bill, we are asking American taxpayers to shell out for more benefits for federal employees while they increasingly feel the harsh bite of inflation. Our committee's priorities do not match reality. We need to find ways to save taxpayer dollars before we increase federal employee benefits again. Therefore, I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and
Madam Chair.
Okay, first I recognize myself, and then I will recognize you, Ms. Norman. I now recognize myself. The Honoring Civil Servants Killed in the Line of Duty Act makes a much-needed change that properly recognizes the service of federal employees across agencies, some of whom put their physical safety at risk to do their jobs on behalf of the American people. I want to thank Subcommittee Chairman Conley for introducing this bill. Companion legislation has passed out of committee in the Senate with bipartisan support. It also has the strong support of several organizations representing federal employees across agencies, including federal law enforcement officers. The bill would implement two important reforms. It would increase the amount of death gratuities and funeral expenses awarded to the families of federal employees. Unfortunately, death gratuities are currently capped at $10,000, and the maximum funeral expenses that they can receive is $800. When federal employees are killed in the line of duty, these limits were put in place decades ago and are woefully insufficient today. This bill lifts the cap on death gratuities to $100,000 and funeral expenses to $8,800. These levels align with what the government is required to pay to families of fallen employees in the Foreign Service and military. The amendment in the nature of a substitute that I'm offering would add a provision to ensure the gratuities are not included in taxable income. This is a common sense reform, and I hope we will be able to finally advance after years of inaction on this issue. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I now yield my remaining time to Chairman Conley.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you for your support. We're talking about 24 individuals, public servants who give their lives in the line of duty. I don't know that any one of us wants to face a firefighter who dies trying to put out fires and save people's homes and lives, and his family, that he's already an overpaid public servant and deserves no more. Is that really what we've descended to? I might point out, in Kentucky, if you work for Kentucky, you qualify for a pension and you die in the line of duty, your family receives a lump sum payment, and 75% of the members' monthly average pay until the spouse's demise. In Georgia, there's a lump sum payment of $100,000, which is what this bill would do for federal civil servants. In Pennsylvania, that number is $164,000, and it gets adjusted with inflation, as our bill would do, every year. Are federal civil servants less worthy than our respective state civil servants? Are we really going to look in the faces of families who've lost a loved one helping others because you think they're too overpaid? Their compensation is too much? We're talking about 24 brave men and women who die every year on America's behalf. I plead with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to think about that. I yield back, Madam Chairwoman.
The gentleman yields back, and I now recognize Mr. Norman.
Thank you, Chair Maloney. You know, and Congressman Connolly, you make great points. It's only 24. You refer back to the last time it's been raised is during the 1960s with the Johnson administration. Back to what Congressman Donalds brought up, you know, we're not even attempting any offsets for anything. And where are the outcries over defund the police, if you're this concerned? Where are the true objections to what many cities across this country are doing to the American people? So I don't hear any outcries from the party, from your party, that is affecting taking money away from law officers, as you say, of first responders who put their life on the line. But as Ranking Member Comer says, there are a lot of benefits that they now get. I'm as sympathetic to those who lose their lives, particularly the heroic duties that they do. But I wish we had some offsets to this, along with so many other things. I wish you could compare the numbers of those in the federal government that were employed during the 1960s that are now going to be employed by this present administration across the board. You know, it's the people that he's putting in on the federal payroll are tax agents and not police officers, which you're trying to cut, and first responders. So anyway, I would just add that I wish we had some, as we do on every other thing, just add to the federal deficit, which is not sustainable. I yield back.
Would Mr. Norman yield for a question?
Oh, yes, ma'am.
Mr. Norman, my assumption is that this applies to every federal employee. Is that correct?
You have to ask Chairman Connolly on that.
But Mr. Connolly, this applies to every federal employee. So you brought up the example of a firefighter, and obviously all of us would be distressed at firefighters giving up their lives. But this would apply to, as Mr. Norman implies, people now currently working for the Obama administration in office jobs?
Well, if you died naturally, no. The phrase is in the line of duty, and that's pretty defined, and that's why it's only 24 a year. We're not talking about millions of people. And by the way, Mr. Norman, you wanted to hear a Democrat say he opposes defund the police. I oppose defunding the police.
Will you yield back?
Yeah, it's your time.
Here's what I would say to that. I don't hear an outcry among, maybe from you that I hadn't heard, but I have not heard an outcry from your party that instigated this for the last couple of years to defund the very people that are trying to protect us. And it's unfair and unfortunate that this is happening. I resent this taking place, to be honest with you, because if the effort were true, let's have them across the board by the ones that are trying to instigate cuts in pay to those who defend this country on a daily basis. It's not right, nor is it fair. I yield back.
Would my friend just yield for one brief?
Oh, yes, sir.
I thank you. I just point out the Federal Law Enforcement Association supports this bill. So if we want to help our police, we could start by helping support this bill. I thank you, and I thank you for yielding.
Yields back. Who else seeks recognition? The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Clay Higgins.
Madam Chair, thank you. I would ask my colleague, the author of the bill, if he would, and I respectfully ask, would you be willing to consider supporting an amendment to your bill clarifying that this was for first responders? You've cited first responders.
Yeah, but you mean would
as a matter of argument, and we support that. Would you support an amendment? I would support your bill if it was focused strictly on first responders, federal employees killed in the line of duty. Would you consider supporting an amendment reflective of that intent?
Would you yield for my answer?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So it depends on how we define first responders. For example,
Firemen, police.
well, what about FEMA? What about?
That's the kind of thing that would work out as we work through the amendment language. That's a legitimate question. I would say my objection would be a carte blanche definition of a federal employee killed in the line of duty. I see where you're getting your numbers from. I'm looking for a way to support the spirit of your bill, good sir. I think there should be further definition of who would receive this benefit.
Yeah, I'm not, I see where my friend is going, and I'm not unsympathetic. I'm just trying to make sure we're not excluding people who really must be included, like a FEMA worker.
If the gentleman, I realize this is a topic that the gentleman passionately supports, and I respect that. I respect the spirit from which you present this bill. But in an effort for bipartisan resolution here, perhaps, if the gentleman would withdraw the bill, I would work closely with you.
Would the gentleman
I would develop new language to further define.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
I will, if the gentleman answers the question on my time, I'll yield. Yes, sir.
Oh, well, I have a question. Okay.
Mr. Kai had directed a question to Mr. Connolly, and then I'll yield.
Okay. Oh, you want me to? I want to ask a question to you. I'm a little confused. Who am I responding to?
You responding to me, sir.
Oh, on the withdrawal issue. I'd have to take that under advisement, but I would just point out to my friend, we have a bill that passed bipartisan on our counterpart committee in the Senate. Was not considered particularly controversial there, and I don't want to get too far afield, and I worry about withdrawing a bill I've worked hard on and that has standing in the Senate, wondering, wither its fate. With the best of intentions, sometimes withdrawing a bill is the kiss of death, and I'm not, that part I'm not willing to.
I understand, and I yield to my colleague, Mr. Gibbs.
Obviously, I think everybody feels that we should do all we can for a police officer, firefighter, first responder. You say there's only 24 of them. But the question of the language I'm concerned about, what if it's just a federal employee who's just driving somewhere, it's not a first responder, he's just, and it's killed in a car accident, that could happen to any of us. That's why I think I agree with my colleague here, Mr. Higgins, that this needs to be tightened up in the language so that doesn't happen, because I don't think we want to have a bill and then a loophole, it's not 24 anymore, it's 24,000 or whatever it could be.
I don't know that we're going to solve that here, but I'm open to tightening the language per Mr. Higgins' suggestion. What I suggest is that between now and when the bill might come up on the floor, we'll work together on language, I hope to your satisfaction. I'm totally open to the argument. I don't want to open this up. I'm trying to deal with the 24 or so we get every year.
I thank the gentleman, and I yield to Mr. Cloud.
Do you offhand know what the compensation, that's a poor term for it, but the benefit package for active duty?
Yes.
Is?
Yes, I think I have that.
Here we go.
So let's see. Well, that's foreign service.
And then military individuals.
Family and military individuals killed in the line of duty receive $100,000, which is what our bill would do.
Right. So my understanding that this would put a IRS worker on par with someone serving in Afghanistan, someone who's gone to the front lines, someone who's, and that's, and I get the intent. I can appreciate it. I'm also concerned how we see definitions change once they get out of our hands and leave us. We've seen literally administrations take a word and interpret it to mean the exact opposite. So in the line of duty, what we mean it to mean today can mean something totally different once this bill is passed. And I think that's at least my concern, and maybe some of the concerns of us. Those on the front line, those whose lives are under risk for service to our nation, we appreciate that. We want their families.
Could I respond, Mr. Cloud?
Yes, sir.
So, number one, in our bill, to tighten that, the agency has to approve it, and it has to be reviewed and approved by the IG, the Inspector General, so that we're not having creep. And, I want to protect people who are out there doing really difficult and dangerous things, who, God forbid, die in that line of duty. My intent is not, and again, it's not like there's a problem here where people are cheating. We're talking about 24 people a year.
Right. No one.
And I want to err, and I hope you do too. I want to err on the side of helping people who, unfortunately, die trying to help their fellow Americans.
Mr. Higgins' time has expired.
Madam Chair, my time has expired. I appreciate my colleague's spirit. I will work with his office to develop language for amendment as the bill approaches the floor, and I'm going to support this bill coming out of committee.
I thank my friend, and I pledge to work with you to try to tighten it up, and with you, Mr. Cloud, as well.
This was productive debate. The question now occurs on the amendment and the nature of a substitute.
May I have some time? May I have some time to kind of finish?
Mr. Cloud is now recognized. Your own time.
Thank you. Is there a way we could better define in the line of duty?
Yes.
To clarify it to what we understand today to be the in the line of duty?
Yes.
Would that be a potential fix?
It would be, and what I'm pledging here is I will work with you and Mr. Higgins and anyone else.
I think, if people are deployed, it's different than a bureaucrat sitting in an office and.
We are where you are in terms of wanting to narrow the definition, but make sure the people in need get what we think they should get. So yes, we will gladly work with you between now and when the bill comes up on the floor for consideration to tighten the definition and amend the bill.
Would Mr. Cloud yield?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Mr. Conley, what Mr. Cloud has raised is a very important issue. I hear all the time from people who have been injured in the services and from their families about the sparse benefits that they get. And you are outlining, or I believe the ranking member was outlining all the benefits that a federal employee gets. But I've never heard that a service member who's killed in the line of duty's wife gets 3/4 of their salary and all these other things. I think we should have a strong comparison between what a service member gets who is killed in the line of duty and what a federal employee gets who's killed in the line of duty. No federal employee, unless they are maybe first responders or firefighters, should have the equivalent pay that somebody who's serving in the service who is killed. I don't think, I just don't think there's any job in the federal government that's as dangerous as serving in the military. And I just think we have to look at this very, very carefully, because I think we make it too great a benefit to work in the federal government and not as good a benefit to serve in the armed forces. So I think we should pull this bill back until we have a chance to really compare the benefits and for full disclosure on the benefits that a federal employee is getting and the benefits that a member of our military gets. And even for 100% disability and those kinds of things, I think we have to look very carefully at this and again at what the cost can be, and there should be an offset. We absolutely should have an offset.
Ms. Fox, may I respond?
Certainly, I'm on Mr. Cloud's time.
Mr. Cloud, may I respond?
I would just point out one thought, too, is that we have to always remember that it's the taxpayers who are funding these, and they do not have the benefits when many of them don't have the pay, therefore they're not able to save or have the same sort of life insurance and benefits that a federal employee already has. So the taxpayer's already generally at a disadvantage in a sense, and so for us to come from their pocket to pay for this, in a sense, there's a concern there. But I will yield the remaining of my time. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Well, as I said, we're talking about 24 people a year. The cost?
For the moment, the concern.
Hopefully,
there's the definitions concern.
Yeah, hopefully we're not.
Hopefully
well,
we'll be able to limit that.
I don't think federal agencies have any intention to broaden the definition. They haven't for years. So it's not been a problem. I would say what Ms. Fox had to say, I think would be a very painful thing to hear if you're a surviving family member whose loved one died putting out wildfires in the West, or who's a federal law enforcement member who died in the line of service, or a FEMA employee who died trying to help people recover from a tornado or a hurricane or natural disaster. And I would say that the same logic Ms. Fox gives us could apply to the state level. I read some of the state benefits. They're more generous than our benefits. So we're simply trying to bring this up to date from Lyndon Johnson's time to do justice to brave men and women who serve America. And I would love to think that on a bipartisan basis we could at least agree on that. And it's 24 people and their families. Thank you for yielding, Mr. Cloud.
The gentleman's time has expired. Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair, I request recognition.
Okay, you're recognized.
When you look at the definition of line of duty in the United States military, that just means you're in a duty status. Unless there's actual criminal activity going on, you know, a line of duty is everywhere you are, everything you're doing. So even you could have mission creep, if you will, or definition creep there when you have that definition of line of duty. So, you know, I would really encourage this bill to be pulled, and what Dr. Fox recommended, that there be a very clear comparison between what the military gets for a death in the line of duty versus what the current federal employee gets for a death in the line of duty. I would really appreciate that. I think that would go a long way to garner support for this bill, and definitely highlight what the differences between the two. So I would ask the gentleman if he would reconsider that. Thank you.
Well,
And I yield to Mr. Biggs.
Thank you, Mr. Clyde. I appreciate the gentleman yielding, and I'm going to yield now to the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you so much. Real quick, Mr. Conley, I do want to state for the record, I really appreciate you working on this matter. I do think what you've brought is an important subject matter that obviously we need to consider. And, you know, freshman in Congress, but served in a state legislative body, I know what it is when you're having to work with the Senate as well to keep your language parallel and the hard work that goes into it. So I really do want to commend you for that. The only thing I would add to really the discussion, it's not about the discussion per se. I just find it to be actually quite healthy. And I think sometimes in Congress, we lose sight of the fact that having disagreements on language is still a healthy process for the way we do our business, the way we should do our business. So, you know, I just appreciate you being willing to engage in this conversation about, you know, the minority's view on refinement of some of the language. And I really appreciate your attentiveness to that, and I really just wanted to make that statement before we kind of close out here.
Thank you, my friend. And as I want to reiterate, I will work with Mr. Higgins and Mr. Cloud and anyone else on making sure the language is tightened. So we're not broadening the definition of line of duty, and we're not broadening categories of who would qualify. We're trying to simply be fair to men and women and their families and bring it into the 21st century 60 years later, I think.
I appreciate that, but, you know, we vote on words, on the meanings of words. And when the meanings of words are not clear, then I think it behooves us that we provide clarity to those so that the rest of us will know exactly what the meaning is.
Yeah, I would just say this is not a new subject. Men and women die every year, 24 on average. And this is, we're not introducing a new subject, sir. And there's a limit, frankly, in terms of how far we ought to go as members of Congress, it seems to me.
Well, I think it's fair. I think it's very fair. I think it's very fair to have a comparison between what the federal benefits are right now, what the federal death benefits are, versus the active duty military benefits. I think all of us need to understand that. And I think that until we do, I don't think this bill should go forward. And so, again, I request that the gentleman would pull his bill until we can work this out, because we vote on words on paper.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Clyde. And one other question, I would assume, Mr. Connolly, that this would probably be a bill that would move by suspension, which does not allow amendments. So I would think that this really needs to be worked out now rather than later. And I yield back to Mr. Clyde.
Mr. Heiss, given the fact that I've introduced the bill, this bill is not going to move in suspension until I have worked with Mr. Higgins and Mr. Cloud on trying to clarify the language. I don't think it's worthy of withdrawal. And I might add, there is a definition of line of duty in the bill. And that's what we're going to work from. You can, page 3, it describes what we're talking about.
What does it say?
You want me to read the whole thing?
I would like the definition of line of duty.
Well, it's page 3 in the bill in front of you.
The entire page is a definition of line of duty?
Pretty much. It describes the results from injuries on line of duty.
I yield back.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Clyde's time has expired. Who else seeks recognition. The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 7376 as amended. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is agreed to.
Madam Chair, I request the yeas and nays.
A recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote is so ordered pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 11 and Committee Rule 5B. Proceedings on the bill are postponed. Okay, pursuant to notice, I now call up 6967, a Chance to Compete Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 6967, the Chance to Compete Act.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6967, offered by Mrs. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as a base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Heiss, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The concept of my bill is simple. It simply deals with those who are applicants to be hired for federal positions to be considered based upon whether they have the skills to do the job. Too frequently, the hiring process is based on whether or not someone has a degree, whether or not the degree has anything to do with the position being sought. And currently, hiring managers also have to rely upon self-assessments that are filled out by the applicants, and of course, that process itself it can become very messy to determine the strengths and weaknesses of the individual. So not surprisingly, that assessment process is not very reliable. So this bill, the Chance to Compete Act, allows agencies to develop appropriate skills-based examinations so applicants can show what they actually know. Federal supervisors have said that their top concern is getting a pool of quality candidates who can do the job, and this bill addresses that problem head-on. It will facilitate agencies sharing information about candidates who have passed assessments, which will make the hiring process more efficient across government, saving both time and money. It also creates teams of subject matter experts to help agencies create assessments that are geared actually for the specific job. This idea is supported by federal managers as well as unions, and I like the bipartisan nature in which it is operating even now, having begun with the Trump administration and now continuing with the Biden administration. And I would personally like to thank Representatives Kohana, Fox, and Fume for their support, as well as Chairman Conley, my colleague on the GovOps subcommittee, Chairwoman Maloney, you and your staff, as well as Mr. Conley and your staff have offered some very valuable input to this, and I'm very grateful that that input has been included in the A&S here, so thank you, each of you, for that. I think this is good policy that will help the American people's government work better, and I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 6967. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Thank you, and I now recognize myself. H.R. 6967, the Chance to Compete Act, is a bipartisan bill aimed at streamlining the federal hiring process and expanding opportunities for federal employees. The bill was introduced last month by Representatives Heiss, Rokana, Fox, and Mfume. A companion Senate bill passed out of committee with bipartisan support. The Chance to Compete Act builds on lessons learned through pilot programs that shift the determination of qualifications for federal employment towards skills-based assessments. The bill would task subject matter experts and agencies with designing assessments that test knowledge specific to a position for which the agency is hiring. Currently, the federal hiring process relies heavily on written self-assessments and education level in determining the qualifications of job applicants. Moving to an assessment method, which this bill would do, would better match qualified applicants with positions and open up employment opportunities to candidates with more diverse professional and educational backgrounds. The bill would also direct the Office of Personnel Management to create a process for sharing technical assessments between agencies and a portal for hiring managers to find candidates who have already demonstrated their qualifications for certain positions but have not yet been hired. The goal is to simplify the hiring process for agencies and shorten the time it takes to bring a new employee on board. The amendment, in the nature of a substitute that I have offered, makes changes that allows agencies to request waivers in certain circumstances and gives OPM necessary flexibility to adapt it as it implements this new policy. I want to thank Representative Heiss for his leadership in introducing this bill and for working with me in a constructive manner to make sensible changes to the bill and smooth the way for enactment. I am encouraged by the bipartisan support for the bill in both the House and Senate, and I want to thank my colleagues who are leading this effort. I hope all of my colleagues will join me in supporting this bill, and I yield back. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Combs.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The House Oversight Committee is charged with overseeing the general management and operations of government agencies. Common to the success of each federal program is a competent and skilled workforce that is able to deliver services to the American people, further the defense of our nation, and help equip the U.S. economy. However, agencies lack the tools to identify and hire the best candidates to fill the broad types of job positions supporting the federal government's various missions and programs. The problem is that hiring for the federal civil service has over-relied on the paper credentials and self-administered job proficiency assessments of candidates. The Chance to Compete Act ensures agencies instead use objective, skills-based assessments to evaluate job candidates. The private sector already uses such structured interviews, knowledge, test, and writing samples for the hiring process. It's time the federal government does so too. Agencies should be able to hire professionals that can do the work, and there are many ways to build the right kind of professional expertise. H.R. 6967 represents one of those rare bipartisan legislative reforms that targets a specific problem, implements tested solutions, and reflects private sector best practices. I want to thank the chairwoman for working with Government Operations Ranking Member Representative Heiss to strengthen this bipartisan bill. I'm committed to working with my colleagues to rapidly advance this legislation through Congress this year. I urge my colleagues to support this smart bill and yield back.
Who else seeks recognition? The question now occurs on the amendment.
Madam Chair.
Dr. Fox, you are now recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Federal hiring practices are broken. These practices rely on how many degrees someone has and on self-evaluations that allow candidates to lie and claim they are, quote, experts at everything rather than being evaluated against an objective standard. This broken process means American taxpayers often pay for employees who cannot properly perform their jobs and fuels the idea that federal employees are incompetent and the butt of many jokes. Fortunately, there's a better way. The Chance to Compete Act is a bill to allow the federal government to hire people based on their ability to do their job and not on how many degrees they have or how they fill out self-assessment. This bill helps identify qualified applicants by codifying a Trump administration's executive order asking agencies to hire people based on objective standards such as structured interviews, knowledge or writing tests, and involve subject matter experts who possess expert knowledge about the competencies and proficiency levels that are essential in successfully performing the job. The Chance to Compete Act even allows agencies to share the results of their applicant screenings with other agencies so that even if a qualified candidate does not get a job at one agency, other agencies could offer that individual a job. This increases the likelihood that qualified people will end up working for the federal government. As the largest employer in the nation with almost 2.2 million employees, it's time for the federal government to hire people based on their ability to do their job and not on a degree that may have no relevance to the position. This is a common sense idea that the private sector figured out long ago. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Lady yields back. Who else seeks recognition? The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 6967 as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is agreed to. H.R. 6967 shall be favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the matters considered by the committee in this markup. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 3544, the Computers for Veterans and Students Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3544, the Computers for Veterans and Students Act.
Okay, without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3544, offered by Mrs. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize myself to speak in support of H.R. 3544, the Computers for Veterans and Students Act. This bill is led by Representative Abigail Spanberger, Rob Whitman, and Elaine Luria, and I applaud the excellent bipartisan work that has gone into advancing it. According to the Census Bureau, only 78% of households in the U.S. owned a desktop or a laptop computer in 2018, leaving tens of millions of households without access to resources that are essential to success in the modern economy. These disparities were made worse by the coronavirus pandemic, during which the lack of quality, home-based access to internet-connected computers and technology equipment prevented many from doing schoolwork, working remotely, or connecting with their loved ones and communities. To address these disparities, this bill would require the GSA to transfer surplus computer and technology equipment from federal agencies to nonprofit computer refurbishers so that they can repair and distribute the computers to educational institutions, veterans, individuals with disability, low-income individuals, students, and seniors in need. The bill would also require these refurbishers to offer relevant computer and technology training programs. I applaud Congresswoman Spanberger and Congressman Whitman for working diligently to incorporate feedback from GSA and other stakeholder groups, including the National Association of State Agencies for Surplus Property, Tech for Troops, Digit Unity, and the Alliance for Technology Refurbishing and Reuse. The amendment in the nature of a substitute strikes the right balance in incorporating these recommendations. The provisions in this bill will help bridge the technology gap for those who lack access to internet-connected computers and the skills to use them, improving access to information and communication technology to help close the digital divide. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back. Who seeks recognition?
Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Cloud, you're now recognized.
Thank you.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3544, offered by Mr. Cloud of Texas.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Computers for Veterans and Students Act is a good piece of legislation that will help increase connectivity by transferring surplus computers and equipment from the GSA to schools, veterans, seniors, and other underserved populations. It's a good win if we can put unused computers to good work benefiting those in underserved communities. My amendment will ensure that this bill includes homeschools in the definition of a school. My amendment is simple. It amends the definition of educational institution to include homeschools, whether or not the homeschool is treated as a homeschool or a private school under state law. The COVID pandemic has caused an unfortunate loss in children's learning due to the closure of our nation's public schools. And while this is certainly a travesty, we have also seen an unprecedented increase in the prevalence of homeschooling. Many families have opted out of traditional homeschooling or traditional school settings in order to teach their children at home. Homeschooling provides families an opportunity to teach their children at home as part of mitigation to exposure to COVID, but it also provided flexibility for families to tailor their children's education to their specific needs. Let's make sure these families have equal access to the refurbished computers made available to those enrolled in traditional schools under this act. And I'll point out, too, that many of the people who homeschool are those in our armed forces who have to move around, and instead of having their children change schools and curriculums every couple years, and foreign service agency or agents as well, who have to move a lot because duty calls, there's many parents who would like to put their kids, homeschool their parents, and so this would help serve them as well. That's my amendment, and I thank you for the opportunity to present it.
Offering this amendment, which I support. This amendment would clarify that refurbished computers could also be distributed to homeschools, in addition to educational institutions, veterans, individuals with disability, low-income individuals, students, and seniors in need. I want to reiterate that this program is intended to help close the digital divide, and that both GSA and nonprofit refurbishers must ensure that technology equipment transferred under this bill go to qualified recipients that truly need them. Under the bill, the federal government can only transfer surplus computer and technology equipment to nonprofit refurbishers that primarily work to improve access to information and communication technology in their mission to bridge the digital divide. So I'm confident that this goal will be upheld. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back. And who else seeks recognition? Well, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. And the amendment is adopted.
Who else seeks recognition?
Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair, I ask to speak on the bill as amended.
Mr. Comer is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Basic computer proficiency and technology equipment are becoming more important for American citizens to participate in an increasingly digital society. We saw this during the pandemic lockdowns and closures. Kids had to do school in front of computer screens, and their parents were subject to endless Zoom meetings. Even here in Congress, we've had to suffer through virtual and hybrid hearings and markups. Hopefully, today's bill will help repurpose federal IT equipment to help Americans participate in our economy. H.R. 3544, the Computers for Veterans and Students Act, aims to help put computers and technology equipment in the hands of students, veterans, disabled individuals, low-income households, seniors in need, and educational institutions. Federal agencies may already transfer surplus federal IT equipment to authorized state agencies who then distribute this equipment to eligible entities. However, not all this tech equipment is immediately usable, and the federal government is not currently authorized to transfer repairable equipment to nonprofit computer refurbishers. To address the issue, H.R. 3544 would allow GSA to transfer computers and tech equipment in need of repair to nonprofit computer refurbishers. These third-party refurbishers would then repair and distribute the equipment directly to students, veterans, and others in need. Additionally, they would be required to offer training programs on the use of the technology. Whether we like it or not, work, education, and even healthcare are rapidly moving online. Those with the resources and necessary technology skills will thrive in this digital economy. Others will need more assistance to close the digital divide. In addition to expanding broadband access, particularly in the rural areas I represent in Kentucky, it's critical we provide these folks with the resources and training to navigate the online world. This bill is a helpful step in that direction. I appreciate Representatives Spanberger and Whitman for their leadership on this legislation. I appreciate Representative Cloud for his good amendment, and I encourage my colleagues to support H.R. 3544.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to it. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 3544 as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. H.R. 3544 shall be favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the matters considered by this committee in this markup. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 7337, the Access for Veterans to Records Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 7337, the Access for Veterans to Records Act.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment. At any point, the chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7337, offered by Mrs. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as a base text. For purposes of amendment, I now recognize myself. I introduce the Access for Veterans to Records Act, along with several of my committee colleagues, to address the serious backlog of requests for veterans records currently pending at the National Personnel Records Center, which is part of the National Archives and Records Administration. Since the beginning of the pandemic, the NPRC has accumulated a backlog of about 600,000 veterans records requests. Veterans and their families need these records in order to access critical service, including housing and health care. Many of these records are only available as paper documents. That, combined with limited building operations and reduced workforce due to the corona pandemic, have been the primary causes of the backlog. The NPRC has recently added overtime shifts on weekends and some holidays, but the backlog remains significant. This is a problem that can only be fixed by legislation. This bill has two components. First, it would require the National Archives to provide the committee with a detailed plan and target timeframes for eliminating the backlog. Second, it would authorize $60 million for archives to make necessary upgrades to its information technology infrastructure. These upgrades are necessary for the archives to digitize documents and prevent another backlog in the future. The committee has already voted to approve $60 million for the archives through an amendment offered by Congressman Keller during the committee's consideration of Build Back Better Act. Unfortunately, this funding was not included in the final House-passed version of the bill. The amendment the committee is considering today includes changes proposed by Ranking Member Comer and Representative Keller. I appreciate their engagement and would like to thank them both for working with me to reach a bipartisan consensus on this bill. The amendment would require NARA to submit a plan for using existing funds to improve its information technology infrastructure. It would also require NARA to submit plans to improve customer service, implement a measurable tracking system, and establish strategies to prevent future record request backlogs. The NARA would also have to report on the status of the records request backlog biannually and ensure they maintain staffing levels to meet the goals of responding to 90% of requests in 20 days or less. Congress needs to take action to help the veterans who have put their lives on hold waiting for records from NPRC. I urge my colleagues to support these veterans by supporting this important legislation. I yield back. Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
Okay. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7337, offered by Mr. Cloud of Texas.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and I reserve a point of order. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am thankful for my colleagues on the other side of the aisle for working with us to achieve a suitable final bill that in part requires the National Personal Records Center to maintain in-person staffing levels to ensure that the backlog of digitizing records is addressed. That provision is very critical, and it's long past due that people who work for the federal government return to work to serve the American people. Over the last couple of years, with the federal government being shuttered, Americans have experienced an unresponsive government. Those wishing to come to petition their government have not been able to do so freely. Those of us who've been working to help veterans are not able to get their records, in large part because in-person staffing in the department and agencies has been non-existent. With that in mind, I'm thankful that we're here voting on this legislation today because it's time to get our veterans their records that they often need to access VA care and education, retirement, and other benefits they have earned. So I have a straightforward amendment that makes common sense. My amendment would improve the bill by making sure that it not only achieves its goal, but is paid for. According to usaspending.gov, $4.6 trillion in funding over the course of COVID has been made available by Congress for agencies to spend. There still remains $60 billion in unspent funds. My amendment would allocate 0.1, that's 0.1% of this unspent money to pay for this act. So let's do the right thing, the common sense thing, and use the millions of dollars that we've already allocated to make sure that this is paid for. I urge the adoption of my amendment, and I yield back.
Yields back. And the gentleman has made a point of order that the proposed amendment is not germane, and the chair is prepared to rule on the point of order. Clause 7 of Rule 16, the germaneness rule provides that no proposition or on a subject different from that under consideration shall be admitted under color of amendment. We have consulted with the parliamentarian, and this amendment is not germane because it invokes the jurisdiction of the Appropriations Committee. Therefore, the amendment offered by the gentleman fails the test of germaneness, and the point of order is sustained.
Madam Chair, I'd like to appeal that order.
Who else seeks recognition?
He appealed the order. Say this.
I move to lay the appeal on the table. The motion is not debatable. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is tabled.
I'll request a roll call, please.
A recorded vote has been requested, and a recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
I vote. I don't vote.
Ms. Norton. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Connolly. Mr. Krishnamurthy. Mr. Raskin. Mr. Khanna. Mr. Mfume. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez. Ms. Tlaib. Ms. Porter. Ms. Bush. Ms. Brown. Mr. Davis. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Mr. Welch.
No.
Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Johnson.
Excuse me, how has Krishnamurthy been recorded?
Mr. Krishnamurthy is not recorded.
I vote no.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes no.
How has Mr. Conley voted?
Mr. Conley is not counted.
No.
Mr. Conley votes no.
How's Mr. Cooper recorded?
Am I supposed to go in order? No. You can recognize Cooper. Okay. Mr. Cooper is not recorded.
Cooper votes no.
How's Mr. Davis recorded?
Mr. Davis is not recorded.
Davis votes no.
How is Ms.
Mr.
Kelly recorded?
Davis votes no.
How is Ms. Kelly recorded?
Ms. Kelly is not recorded.
Kelly votes no.
Madam Chair, this is Wasserman Schultz. How am I recorded?
Ms. Wasserman Schultz is not recorded.
Wasserman Schultz votes no.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes no.
John Sarbanes, how am I recorded?
Mr. Sarbanes is not recorded.
Sarbanes votes no.
Mr. Sarbanes votes no.
Have they gone through it?
Madam Chair, this is Mr. DeSaulnier. How am I recorded?
Mr. DeSaulnier is not recorded.
Oh.
Nope. DeSaulnier votes no.
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes no.
Madam Clerk, how am I recorded?
Madam Chair, point of order.
The problem is the committee keeps saying vote
In
yes.
order
and
now,
they're
we're
saying
doing
it-
a roll call vote.
Madam Chairman, have both sides equally voted, and then you go back?
How am I recorded? How am I recorded? Congresswoman Norton, how is she?
Members are allowed to ask how they're recorded at any time.
How am I recorded, Madam Chair? How am I recorded?
Who is saying that?
How am I recorded? I can
Congresswoman
ask at any
Norton
time. How am I
asked-
recorded?
Mr. Keller, you're not recorded.
I want to vote yes.
Mr. Keller votes yes.
Oh, excuse me, I want to vote no. I want to vote no.
Mr. Keller votes, Mr. Keller votes no.
I want to be
Madam
yes.
Chair, Congressman Welch, how am I recorded?
Clerk, or, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairwoman, can the clerk just start calling those that have not voted again?
Yeah.
Is that possible?
Should we start
You
over?
all started this, not us.
Due
I'd like
to
to change my
confusion,
vote.
let's start from the top and just call the roll.
Madam Chair, maybe we should start the meeting over so everybody's here for it and have an in-person meeting.
We're here.
You're not recognized.
All due respect,
Mr.
we were
Johnson.
here.
Okay. Ms. Spear. Ms. Lawrence. Mr. Gomez. He was on. Ms. Presley. Mr. Comer.
Sorry, how is Krishnamurthy recorded on this last vote?
Mr. Krishnamurthy, you are a no.
I'd like to change that to yes, please.
How is Mr. Latourneau recorded?
Who? Mr. Latourneau, you're not recorded.
Latourneau is a no.
Mr. Latourneau votes no.
How is Ms. Norton how is Ms. Norton recorded?
Ms. Norton is not recorded.
Ms. Norton votes yes.
Ms. Norton votes yes.
Regular order, Madam Chair. My goodness. We've got a process here.
I recognize we're in the middle of a roll call vote.
We're in the middle of a roll call vote, okay? Just call the roll call vote.
Okay. Mr. Jordan. Ms. Fox.
No, they didn't call my name.
Called your name.
I did.
No, well, one of your members interrupted and you went straight to her before I entered, but Mr. Comer votes no.
Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Jordan. Ms. Fox. Mr. Heiss. Mr. Grothman.
No.
Mr. Cloud.
No.
Mr. Gibbs. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins votes no. Mr. Norman. Mr. Sessions.
Sessions, no.
Mr. Sessions votes no. Mr. Biggs.
No.
Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. Clyde.
No.
Mr. Clyde votes no. Ms. Mace. Mr. Franklin.
No.
Mr. Franklin votes no. Mr. Fallon.
Fallon votes no.
Mr. Fallon votes no. Ms. Harrell.
Ms. Harrell votes no.
Ms. Harrell votes no. Mr. Donalds. Ms. Maloney.
Yes. Does anyone wish to change their vote?
Ms.
Or
Maloney
is
votes
anyone
yes.
not recorded?
Madam Chairman.
Mr. Heiss is
Mr.
not recorded.
Davis
Heiss votes no.
Mr. Heiss votes no.
How's Mr. Davis recorded?
Mr. Davis is not recorded.
And I forgot to mention that.
Davis votes aye.
Clerk, how is Talib voted?
This is Ms. Porter. How am I
Ms. Porter.
vote yes?
This is Miss Kelly.
Ms.
I'd
Porter
like
votes
to change
yes.
my vote.
Oh, come on.
Ms. Kelly, you're recorded as a no.
I'd like to change to a yes.
How is Krishnamurthy recorded?
Mr. Krishnamurthy, you're counted as a yes.
Thank you.
How's
This is
Cooper
Mr.
recorded?
Connolly. This is Mr. Connolly. How am I recorded?
Mr. Cooper, you're recorded as
I'd
a
like to
no.
vote yes.
Can we just call the
I'd like to
roll?
vote yes, please.
Call the roll again. Call the roll.
Brown is here. I'd like to vote yay, please.
Talib votes yes.
Spear votes yes.
Okay.
How is Mr. Connolly recorded?
Never voted.
Hello?
Congressman Gomez, aye.
Connolly?
Conley recorded.
Mr. Connolly is not recorded.
Mr. Connolly votes aye.
Mr. Connolly votes yes.
How is Ms. Talib recorded?
Ms. Talib voted aye.
Madam Chair, I'd like to point out to all the Democrat members in their offices on Zoom, there's plenty of seats on the Democrat side in the committee room if they wanted to come
You're
down
not
and vote.
recognized. You are not recognized.
Madam Chair, this is Jackie Spear. How am I recorded?
I don't know.
Ms. Spear is not recorded.
Spear votes aye.
Madam Chair, this is
Congressman Welch. How am I recorded?
Ms. Brown, you're not recorded.
All right, I
Ms.
think we can
Brown
go.
votes aye.
Ms. Brown votes aye.
This is Congressman
Mr.
Welch.
Welch.
How am I recorded?
You are recorded as a no.
I wish to be recorded as an aye.
Madam Chair, this is Corey Bush. How am I recorded?
The committee will come to order. The clerk will continue.
Ms. Bush, you're not recorded.
Bush is an aye.
Ms. Bush votes aye.
Bush,
How is Congressman Gomez recorded?
Mr. Gomez, you're not recorded.
Gomez, aye.
Mr. Gomez votes aye.
Madam Chair, Steve Lynch, how am I recorded?
Mr. Lynch is not recorded.
Mr. Lynch votes aye.
Mr. Lynch votes aye.
Madam Chair, this is Congressman DeSaulnier. How am I recorded?
Okay. Mr. DeSonia, you're recorded as a no.
I'd like to change that vote to an aye, please.
Mr. DeSonia votes aye.
Sarbanes, how's Sarbanes recorded?
Mr. Sarbanes, you're recorded as a no.
I'd like to change that to a yes.
Mr. Sarbanes votes yes.
How am I recorded?
Ms. Lawrence, you are not recorded.
I would like to vote yes.
Ms. Lawrence votes yes.
Madam Chair, how am I recorded?
Ms. Wasserman Schultz, you're recorded as a no.
Wasserman Schultz votes aye. Madam Chair, is my vote recorded as aye?
Ms. Wasserman Schultz, you're recorded as aye.
Thank you.
Is there anyone who is not recorded?
Madam Chair, how am I recorded?
Ms. Fox, you are not recorded.
I vote no.
Ms. Fox votes no.
Is there anyone who would like to change their vote or is not recorded? The clerk will report the tally when ready.
There are 19 ayes and 14 noes.
The motion to table is agreed to. Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
Okay. The clerk will report the amendment.
Madam Chair, I would, if I can, I'd like to hold and allow my colleague, Representative Cloud, to go ahead with an amendment he has.
After the clerk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7337, offered by Mr. Scott Franklin of Florida.
Okay. Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized from Florida to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the efforts of the committee to try to get the National Personnel Records Center back up in order so we can take care of veterans and folks who need their services. To me, it's been a travesty of justice that this is allowed to go on as long as it has. How these workers were never deemed to be essential to begin with escapes me. But as we've heard in testimony here before the committee, the records are not digitized. They're in paper form. So it is not possible for employees to work to do telework and actually perform their job. So the issue I have with this, as it's currently presented, is telework would still be allowed while we still maintain a backlog of records that, as you note, is 600,000 and growing now. I currently have 3 constituents at home in my district who have been waiting for over a year for a ruling on their VA eligibility. We have people who are going to die waiting for these folks to come back to work and do their jobs. So while I applaud the effort to get them back up and running, I also applaud the efforts to use COVID money that's already been set aside instead of spending more money for this. I also think we need to amend the definition to say that telework, which cannot be performed when all the records have to be manually handled in person, should not be allowed at all until this backlog is caught up. And the fact that the bill would call for a report, a semi-annual report, to let us know how we're doing on the backlog after 2 years tells me that there's not even an effort to get this backlog caught up in a 2-year period. So I would just ask my colleagues to consider this. I like what we're trying to do. I like the spirit and the direction we're going, but I think we need to we need to not continue to pay people to stay home from work when it's not possible to do their jobs. And with that, I yield back.
Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Keller.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And while I appreciate the fact of making sure our veterans get their records on time, The performance metric contained in the bill gets us to pre-pandemic levels as far as responding to records within 20 days or less. I'm not sure that, the amount of people they have there, if they can do it more efficiently with fewer people, just making sure people are there gets the job done. However, having seen what I just witnessed here in this committee with people not showing up to work, I think I'm inclined to support the amendment simply because, I don't know, we need to show up to work. It just needs to be managed well. I'm willing to say let's make sure that federal employees get back to work and get the job done on behalf of our taxpayers. Like I said, I'm more concerned with the performance metric of getting the work done rather than how many people it takes to get it done.
Would my colleague yield for a moment on that? I appreciate what you're saying as well. I think most taxpayers who would be watching this hearing would say, then why on earth do we have people on the government payroll who effectively have had a 2-year paid vacation during COVID because they were not able to perform their job? And if we're going to go back to post-COVID world now where we try to get back to things as normal, why do we have people on the payroll who aren't necessary? If they're able to get to the pre-pandemic levels and still have folks sitting at home on the couch, then I think we got too many people on the payroll.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with you, and I don't think putting an arbitrary number there gets them to their pre-pandemic levels. Good management does, and that's just not by adding more headcount.
No, I understand that, but I think that allowing telework at all is, when we still have a backlog, is inexcusable. If they can't perform their job while teleworking at all, then I would say bring them back and catch up the backlog even quicker. It's not like we were caught up to 0 days backlog pre-COVID. So if there's anyone on the payroll who's able to come in and do the job, I think they should be there and not at home. Telework isn't another name for paid vacation.
No, I think people get the job done coming to work, and I think the bill gets to that. I think an arbitrary number of saying you have to have this many employees to get it done doesn't get the job done. It just has more employees there. We need, the amount of people in an organization doesn't drive a performance metric. The performance metric isn't people with their behinds at one location. The performance metric is, are they getting the records cleared? And that's what we should be focused on rather than the number of people it takes to do. In other words, it takes people to do it, but we need to make sure they're working effectively.
I understand. My amendment does not cite employee headcounts. It specifically says no telework would be allowed. I don't care how many people are on the payroll, but if they're on the payroll and working remotely, it shouldn't be. It just strikes the language of telework.
It says, if I got the amendment right, and it says insert at pre-pandemic in-person staffing levels until all veterans' paper records at National Personnel Record Centers have been digitized and therefore maintaining staffing levels. Is that the amendment?
I don't have that with me.
Yeah.
Okay, yep, I see what you're saying. All right, my effort was to attempt to remove the language of teleworking as part of the allowable solution to this process.
No, I think we want the same thing. We want our veterans taken care of, most definitely. But it can be done, it should be done as efficiently and effectively as possible. So that's, I guess.
So I would withdraw the amendment if we can ensure that there's language in what does get approved that that teleworking, until we're caught up, would not be allowed, because there is no such thing as teleworking for this organization now until those records are digitized.
Are there any records currently digitized?
Some.
Yeah, okay. So, again, I would say that good management would be saying cleaning up the records, and that's how they do it, quite frankly. As long as our veterans are getting the service they need, it gets done. I think we're after the same thing. So, thanks, and I yield back.
Did you withdraw your amendment?
Yeah, Madam Chairman, I will withdraw the amendment.
The amendment has been withdrawn. Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
Who has got the amendment? Mr. Cloud, okay. The clerk will report the amendment. Mr. Cloud's amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7337, offered by Mr. Cloud of Texas.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized to explain the amendment, and I reserve a point of order.
Madam Chair, this seeks to address the same funding issue that we discussed and maybe consider a different approach to it in light of the point of order. To Mr. Franklin's point in his amendment, the American taxpayer has already paid for this work to be done. And as the federal workforce at this warehouse has not worked for the last year, as veterans have waited sick and waiting for approval of their benefits, this is unconscionable. And so my amendment would strike on page 3, line 29, there is authorized to be appropriated, and after an insert on page 3, line 22, after 60 million, insert of which no new funding may be used. And so the point is, of course, that we have $60 billion of unused COVID relief funds. This was related to COVID, and for us to be able to use the funds that have already been appropriated would be appropriate in this time. I understand that you have a point of order ready to go, and if we can work together, I am willing to withdraw my amendment. If we can work to make sure that we find a way to fund this from the dollars that are already appropriated.
I agree to work with you. We need to get this backlog taken care of, and we'd be glad to work with you, but let's move it and work between now and when it gets to the floor.
Sure. So
Okay.
you'll work with me to make sure that it's
Absolutely.
paid for out of funds already? Okay.
We'll work on language going forward.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. I will withdraw.
Who else seeks recognition?
Mr. Comer.
Mr. Comer is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In response to complaints from our constituents, committee Republicans opened an investigation more than a year ago into the Veterans Records request backlog at the National Personnel Records Center. And I think what you've seen here today is Republicans on the Oversight Committee are serious about trying to get the federal workforce back to work. While the Democrats continue to focus on trying to pass more enhanced benefits for federal employees, Republicans are simply trying to get the federal employees who have been off from work in the name of COVID for the past 2 years back to work. That's what the taxpayers want. That's what Republicans on this committee are fighting for. What we found in our investigation was deeply disturbing. The NPRC had kept staff at home while allowing a backlog of nearly 500,000 record requests from our veterans and their families to pile up. Processing these record requests is critical to ensuring our veterans receive the medical care and benefits they are entitled to. We urge the chairwoman to hold hearings and press the NPRC to get staff back to work in person. However, the backlog grew to over 600,000 requests as of the beginning of March 2022. To address this issue, my colleague, Mr. Keller, introduced the Records Act in June of last year to require the NPRC staff to return to work. Thank you, Mr. Keller, for doing that. After significant pressure from this committee, the NPRC finally returned to in-person staffing on March the 7th of this year, a few weeks ago. I'd like to thank the chairwoman for bringing the Access to Veterans Records Act before us today to ensure the NPRC continues to address the underlying causes of the backlog. We appreciate your willingness to work with us on amending H.R. 7337 and incorporate several of our revisions that Mr. Cloud mentioned, and of course Mr. Keller and Mr. Franklin. This amended bill will ensure that the backlog will be resolved by requiring the NPRC to maintain in-person staffing levels and providing necessary funds to speed up digital preservation of records. The amended bill also provides additional reporting requirements to ensure the backlog is addressed and that the current situation never happens again. The amended bill proves that this committee can work together in a bipartisan way to pass legislation that is truly responsive to the immediate needs of the American people and improves government efficiency. I urge my colleagues to support this bill as amended, and I yield back.
Who else seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Norman.
Question, I guess, to Mr. Comer. Do you know if this bill has full designates the time that they have to come back. In other words, a full 8 hours. I'm told that a lot of offices are returning to work, but they're going till 12 o'clock, and there's no definition of what a full day's work, 40 hours a week in most cases for most businesses. Do you know if that's spelled out in here?
Doesn't say a timeline. It's not a timeline. Okay. It's my understanding it's not a timeline. It just allows him to come back to work in person to try to get to work on digitizing the records. So I don't know. I don't know the specific answer to your question. I share your frustration, and we've been ringing the bell on this for over a year. Yeah, and they are back for full-time since March 7th. They've been back full-time for a couple of weeks now.
The reason I mention it, Social Security in my area is not coming back. They're doing odd hours. I just hired one of the employees whose conscience got to her because you had lines in the parking lot. They're coming to work from 9 to 12 and going home. And so if it's not spelled out, I don't know.
Right. Yeah, I don't know about Social Security. I know we have some offices that are the same. We have some that have come back, it seems, I think, in Kentucky. But the PRC came back to work on March the 7th. So.
Okay, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? Mr. Keller.
Thank you, Madam Chair. America's veterans honorably served our nation, defending our freedoms and our way of life. Our government must ensure these heroes are not subjected to bureaucratic red tape upon returning home from their service. However, that's exactly what has happened to hundreds of thousands of veterans. They have waited in limbo for months and years to receive basic veterans benefits. The COVID-19 pandemic caused the National Personnel Records Center to scale down its operations to 25% capacity, and as a result of its reduced operations, the MPRC has amassed a records backlog, as you have mentioned, up to 600,000 records or requests. The service records are vital for accessing medical benefits, filing disability claims, and requesting regalia or commendation, such as Purple Hearts. Our office, as mentioned, has been dealing with cases of veterans, as many have here in Congress. Their families, cases of veterans and their families not being attended to in a timely fashion. This is not only problematic, it's unacceptable, and we must work to resolve the issue as quickly as possible. H.R. 7337, the Access to Veterans Records Act, while we're working together, and it proves that we can do that, we need to pass the legislation for the American people, particularly our veterans. We're looking to eliminate the backlog of over 500,000 records requests, and while also modernizing the National Personnel Records Center to ensure a backlog of veterans records requests never happens again. It began during the pandemic, this backlog, and it was made worse by poor management policies. The height, and again, I can talk about that again, 600,000 records backlog. That's unacceptable. I mean, because people didn't want to come to work, or we didn't lay out the plan for them to come to work. And I say we, I say the federal government. I'm glad the chairwoman agreed to revisions to the bill that ensure the backlog is relieved, many of which came from a bill, as the ranking member mentioned, was introduced almost a year ago, H.R. 3710. It had 75 co-sponsors. But the most important revision is the requirement of the MPRC to maintain in-person staffing levels and also performance metrics. We need all of the people back at the MPRC staffed regularly for a full day's work in person to solve the problem. Most of the records are not digitally preserved. MPRC employees must be in the office to fulfill the records request. The National Archives and Records Administration informed us at the beginning of this month that in order to effectively address the backlog, it needs to be responding to requests within 20 days. The bill ensures that employees go to work and satisfy the needs of our veterans. It provides resources to begin the process of digitally preserving records. Once digitation process is complete, This will allow the MPRC to be pandemic-proof through, and the ability to fulfill requests under any circumstance. The bill is an opportunity for the committee to come together and ensure our veterans receive the care and service they deserve. I urge my colleagues to support this, but as mentioned, we need to make sure that the safeguards are in place to prevent this kind of poor management in the future and to give our veterans the service they have earned and deserve. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and I thank him for his work on this bill. The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 7337 as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. H.R. 7337 shall be favorably reported to the House without objection. A motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the matters considered by the committee in this markup. There being no further discussion on amendments, we now turn to recorded votes on the pending amendments that have been postponed. In order to coordinate with other committees and give as sufficient notice to members, we will recess and take those votes at 12:45. The committee stands in recess.
testing for Lynch.
It's 10 minutes past the time the chair said we would be reconvening. Any status updates for our members?
The committee will come to order.
The committee will come to order, and it's now time to take the postponed votes. Members are reminded to be ready to unmute themselves when they are called to vote. Members are further reminded that pursuant to House rules, their video must be on in order to vote. And we are first going to go to H.R. 1756, final passage of 1756. A recorded vote has been requested. On favorably reporting H.R. 1756 as amended, a recorded vote is so ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Norton.
Speak.
Ms. Norton votes yes.
Ms. Norton votes yes. Mr. Lynch.
Mr. Lynch votes aye.
Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Cooper.
Cooper votes aye.
Mr. Cooper votes aye. Mr. Connolly.
Yep.
One more.
Mr. Connolly votes aye. Mr. Krishnamurthy.
Aye.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes aye. Mr. Raskin. Mr. Khanna.
Aye.
Mr. Khanna votes aye. Mr. Mfume. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
Aye.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes aye. Ms. Tlaib.
Talib votes yes.
Ms. Tlaib votes yes. Ms. Porter.
Yes.
Ms. Porter votes yes. Ms. Bush.
Bush votes yes.
Ms. Bush votes yes. Ms. Brown.
Yes.
Ms. Brown votes yes. Mr. Davis.
Davis votes aye.
Mr. Davis votes yes. Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
Wasserman Schultz votes aye.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Sarbanes.
Sarbanes votes aye.
Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Ms. Spear.
Spear votes aye.
Ms. Spear votes aye. Ms. Kelly.
Kelly votes aye.
Ms. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Lawrence.
Okay, I'll be here, you don't have to worry about it.
Okay. Mr. DeSaulnier.
Sonia votes aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye. Mr. Gomez.
Gomez, aye.
Mr. Gomez votes aye. Ms. Presley. Mr. Comer. Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes no. Ms. Fox.
Fox votes no.
Ms. Fox votes no. Mr. Heiss.
No.
Mr. Heiss votes no. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman votes no. Mr. Cloud.
No.
Mr. Cloud votes no. Mr. Gibbs. Mr. Gibbs votes no. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins votes no. Mr. Norman.
Norman votes no.
Mr. Norman votes no. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions votes no. Mr. Keller. Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Biggs. Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. Clyde.
No.
Mr. Clyde votes no. Miss Mace. Miss Mace votes no. Mr. Franklin.
No.
Mr. Franklin votes no. Mr. LaTurner.
This is Miss Lawrence, how am I recorded?
Should I keep going? Okay. Ms. Lawrence, you are not recorded.
I would like to vote yes.
Ms. Lawrence votes yes.
How am I
Miss-
recorded?
Okay, Mr. LaTurner. Mr. Fallon.
Fallon votes no.
Mr. Fallon votes no. Ms. Harrell. Mr. Donald. Mr. Donald votes no. Ms. Maloney. Ms. Maloney votes yes. Mr. Welch.
Mr. Welch votes yes.
Mr. Welch votes yes.
Wishing to change his or her vote?
Madam Chair, this is Hank Johnson. How am I recorded?
Mr. Johnson, you are not recorded.
I vote yay.
Mr. Johnson votes yea.
Will report the tally when ready.
How is Ms. Presley recorded?
How is Ms. Presley recorded?
Ms. Presley is not recorded.
Ms. Presley votes yay.
Ms. Presley votes yea.
The clerk will report the tally when ready.
Madam Chair, how is Mr. LaTurner recorded?
Mr. LaTurner is not recorded.
LaTurner votes no.
Mr. LaTurner votes no. We have 23 ayes and 18 noes.
H.R. 1756 shall be favorably reported to the House without objection. A motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the matters considered by the committee in this markup. A recorded vote was previously requested on H.R. 7376 as amendment. A recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Norton.
Ms. Norton votes yes.
Ms. Norton votes yes. Mr. Lynch.
Mr. Lynch votes yes.
Mr. Lynch votes yes. Mr. Cooper.
Cooper votes yes.
Mr. Cooper votes yes. Mr. Connolly.
Mr. Conley votes aye.
Mr. Connolly votes yes. Mr. Krishnamurthy.
Aye.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes aye. Mr. Raskin. Mr. Khanna.
Aye.
Mr. Khanna votes yes. Mr. Mfume. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
Aye.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes aye. Ms. Tlaib.
Tlaib votes yes.
Ms. Tlaib votes yes. Ms. Porter.
Yes.
Ms. Porter votes yes. Ms. Bush.
Yes.
Ms. Bush votes yes. Ms. Brown.
Yes.
Ms. Brown votes yes. Mr. Davis.
Davis votes yes.
Mr. Davis votes yes. Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
Wasserman Schultz votes aye.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes yes. Mr. Welch.
Welch votes yes.
Mr. Welch votes yes. Mr. Johnson.
Johnson votes aye.
Mr. Johnson votes yes. Mr. Sarbanes.
Sarbanes votes yes.
Mr. Sarbanes votes yes. Ms. Spear.
Spear votes yes.
Ms. Spear votes yes. Ms. Kelly.
Kelly votes yes.
Ms. Kelly votes yes. Ms. Lawrence. Mr. DeSaulnier.
Sonier votes yes.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes yes. Mr. Gomez.
Gomez, aye.
Mr. Gomez votes yes. Ms. Presley.
Presley votes yes.
Ms. Presley votes yes. Mr. Comer. Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes no. Ms. Fox. Ms. Fox votes no. Mr. Heiss.
No.
Mr. Heiss votes no. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman votes no. Mr. Cloud. He said yes. Mr. Cloud votes yes. Mr. Gibbs. Mr. Gibbs votes no. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins votes yes. Mr. Norman.
Norman votes no.
Mr. Norman votes no. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions votes no. Mr. Keller. Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Biggs. Mr. Clyde.
No.
Mr. Clyde votes no. Ms. Mace. Ms. Mace votes no. Mr. Franklin. Mr. Franklin votes no. Mr. LaTurner.
LaTurner votes no.
Mr. LaTurner votes no. Mr. Fallon.
Allen votes no.
Mr. Fallon votes no. Ms. Harrell. Mr. Donalds. Mr. Donalds votes yes. Ms. Maloney.
Maloney votes yes.
Maloney votes yes.
This is Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence. How am I recorded?
Ms. Lawrence, you are not recorded.
I vote yes.
Ms. Lawrence votes yes.
Is there any member who has not yet voted? Is there any member wishing to change their vote? The clerk will report the tally when ready.
We have 26 yeas and 14 noes.
The House shall favorably report H.R. 7376 to the House floor without objection. A motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the matters considered by the committee in this markup. And before we adjourn, we have one final piece of business which I will dispose of very quickly. Pursuant to notice, I call up the following postal naming bills, which were distributed in advance. H.R. 1095, 4622, 5349, 5809, 5865, 5900, 6039, 6041, 6042, 6175, 6267, 6614, 6917, 7371, an amendment in the nature of the substitute for H.R. 6402. Without objection, the bills are considered read, and I request unanimous consent for their immediate consideration en bloc. Without objection, the bills are passed. There being no further business, I want to thank you all for your participation today. The committee stands adjourned.